There are strategies that enemies spend decades designing and adversaries spend decades executing. And then there are moments when the target simply hands the strategy over, fully formed, at no cost to anyone who wanted it. The period between January and May of this year belongs entirely to the second category. Across 3 NATO ministerial sessions, 2 bilateral phone calls with Vladimir Putin that were not shared with European allies in real time, 1 publicly announced pause in weapons deliveries to Ukraine, and a series of statements from the Oval Office that were repeated almost verbatim in Russian state media within hours of their delivery, the United States produced something that the Kremlin's strategic planning apparatus has been trying to manufacture for the better part of 2 decades. It did not manufacture it through disinformation, through election interference, through cyber attack, or through any of the tools that 7 Senate intelligence reports have documented in forensic detail. The United States produced it voluntarily, in public, with the cameras rolling, and the architects of Russian grand strategy recorded every frame. The Kremlin's core strategic objective since at least 2007 has been documented in enough declassified intelligence assessments, think tank analyses, and intercepted communications that it is no longer a matter of analytical dispute. Russia wants a Europe that cannot coordinate its own defense without American permission, a NATO that cannot reach consensus without American leadership, and an America that is too consumed by internal political contests to exercise either function reliably. The precise mechanism for achieving this outcome has shifted depending on the available opportunity. What has never shifted is the destination. A weakened transatlantic alliance that fractures along the fault lines of national self-interest is not incidental to Russian foreign policy. It is the policy. Every military action Russia has taken in its near abroad since 2008, every disinformation campaign documented by European intelligence services, every gas supply cut timed to arrive at the onset of a northern European winter has been a tool in service of that single strategic goal. The goal is not territorial. Russia does not need more territory. The goal is structural. Russia needs the architecture of Western collective security to collapse under its own contradictions, and it needs that collapse to appear self-inflicted. What happened in the opening months of this year gave the Kremlin more structural progress toward that goal than any single operation it has attempted since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. It happened in stages that were each individually explicable as domestic American politics and collectively readable from Moscow as a coherent strategic gift. The first stage was the phone calls. Trump spoke with Putin on 2 occasions in February, the first call lasting approximately 90 minutes and the second lasting slightly over 2 hours, without providing European allied governments with a full readout of the exchanges. The White House released summary statements after each call. Both summaries were shorter than the calls by a ratio that intelligence professionals immediately noted. French, German, and British officials were briefed separately after the fact by American counterparts who had themselves received only partial information. 3 senior European diplomatic sources speaking to international correspondents on background in the days that followed used the same phrase independently of one another to describe the experience of being briefed. They described it as being told what Washington wanted them to hear. The distinction between a full Allied readout and a curated one is not procedural. It is structural. The readout is the mechanism through which allies coordinate their positions before the next contact with the adversary. Removing that mechanism does not merely inconvenience European capitals. It breaks the coordination function that collective security depends upon, and it does so invisibly, leaving no fingerprints and requiring no Russian action whatsoever. The second stage was the pause. In March, the administration announced a temporary suspension of a specific category of weapons delivery to Ukraine, described in official statements as a review of existing commitments. The pause lasted 22 days. During those 22 days, Russian artillery units on the Eastern Front increased their daily shell expenditure by an estimated 31%, according to battlefield monitoring organizations operating in the region. Ukrainian defensive positions in 2 sectors that had been stable for the preceding 6 months came under pressure that commanders on the ground attributed directly to the ammunition advantage the pause created. The pause ended and deliveries resumed, and the administration pointed to the resumption as evidence that commitment to Ukraine remained intact. What that framing did not address was the battlefield effect of the 22 days themselves, which was measurable, or the signal the pause sent to every government in the world that was watching, which was unmeasurable but permanent. A pause is not merely a policy instrument. It is a message. The message this pause sent, in the language that governments and military planners read, was that American support for Ukraine was contingent, negotiable, and subject to withdrawal under domestic political pressure. That message cannot be unsent. It lives in every subsequent Ukrainian military planning document, every subsequent European defense budget discussion, and every subsequent Russian negotiating position. The Kremlin did not request the pause. It did not need to. The pause arrived without being asked for, carrying exactly the information that Russian strategic planning required. The third stage was the language. Trump made a series of public statements between February and May that were notable not merely for their content, but for the precision with which they mapped onto Russian state media's preferred narrative architecture. The statements described NATO as a protection racket. They described European allies as free riders who had exploited American generosity for decades. They described Ukraine's government in terms that echoed, sometimes word for word, the characterizations that RT and Sputnik had been applying to Kyiv since 2022. Russian state media did not need to editorialize. Anchors and analysts on the three main state television channels simply played the clips and then sat in silence for several seconds, a production technique that Russian broadcast journalism uses when the footage is considered to speak sufficiently for itself. The spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry, in a daily briefing that attracted more international attention than her briefings typically generate, described Trump's statements as a welcome return to realism and noted that leaders who speak honestly about the limits of their obligations are easier to negotiate with than leaders who make promises they cannot keep. That last clause was not an observation. It was a preview of the negotiating posture Russia intended to adopt in any subsequent diplomatic engagement. It was also a direct response to Trump's own public framing, which the Kremlin had absorbed, processed, and converted into a tactical advantage within 72 hours of delivery. The reason all three of these stages matter is not that any single one of them was irreversible. Pauses can end. Readouts can resume. Language can shift. What makes the combination significant is what it produced in the countries watching from the outside, specifically the 31 NATO member states that have been conducting their own internal assessments of American reliability since January, and the conclusions those assessments have reached. Finland, which shares a 1,300-kilometer border with Russia and joined NATO in 2023 after decades of studied neutrality, began accelerating its own domestic defense production in February at a rate that its defense ministry described publicly as a response to changed strategic circumstances. Poland announced a defense budget increase that would bring it to 4% of GDP, the highest of any NATO member, citing what its foreign minister called the need to ensure Polish security cannot depend on any single external guarantee. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania held an emergency trilateral defense meeting in March that was not originally on the calendar and was not widely reported at the time, but whose joint communiqué, released afterward, contained language about self-sufficiency in deterrence that had no precedent in the history of Baltic security documents. These countries are not panicking. They are adjusting. The adjustment they are making is the one Russia has always wanted them to make, which is to begin treating the American security guarantee as unreliable and to begin planning accordingly. When countries plan for American unreliability, they stop coordinating their positions through Washington and start coordinating them around Washington. That is a different alliance. That is, in structural terms, precisely the alliance Russia has been attempting to create through 40 years of active measures and intelligence operations, and it is now being created faster and more completely than Russian operations ever managed by the statements and actions of the American president himself. The intelligence community's discomfort with this trajectory has been expressed through the channels available to it, which are limited and mostly indirect. The Director of National Intelligence presented the annual threat assessment to the Senate Intelligence Committee in March and devoted an unusual amount of time to what the document described as adversary exploitation of alliance uncertainty. That phrase, adversary exploitation of alliance uncertainty, is intelligence community language for a specific phenomenon. It means that a foreign power has identified a weakness in Western coordination and is actively leveraging it. The threat assessment identified the weakness. It did not name the President of the United States as its source, because intelligence assessments presented to Congress do not operate that way. It did not need to. The senators on the committee who pressed the director on the origins of the uncertainty received answers that were, in the careful phrasing of the intelligence community, responsive to the question asked. 3 senators asked follow-up questions that were also, in their careful phrasing, not ambiguous about what they were actually asking. The director answered all 3. The transcript was released publicly 2 weeks later. It has been read in full by every major Allied intelligence service. None of them have commented publicly. All of them have drawn their own conclusions. What the Kremlin understands about this moment that the American domestic political conversation has largely failed to absorb is the difference between intent and effect. The argument that Trump's positions represent genuine America First nationalism rather than any kind of coordination with Russian interests is probably correct as a description of intent. Trump has never needed external instruction to reach positions that benefit Russia because his instincts about alliances, about the value of collective security, and about the purpose of American global engagement have been consistent for 35 years, long before any documented Russian influence operation targeted him. His skepticism about NATO predates his political career. His admiration for strongman leadership styles is a matter of public record going back to the 1980s. His preference for bilateral deals over multilateral frameworks is the organizing principle of everything he has done in business and in government. None of this required Russian engineering. What Russia understood, and what the last 4 months have confirmed, is that intent is irrelevant to strategic effect. A wall does not care why the wrecking ball was swung. The alliance architecture that took 70 years to build does not care whether the force applied against it was coordinated or merely convenient. The Kremlin has been trying to swing its own wrecking ball at that architecture for 2 decades and has never landed a clean hit. It has now watched someone else land several without being asked in the space of 4 months, and the structural damage is visible to every engineer who has been watching the building. The financial and commercial dimensions of this shift are already registering in ways that planners are unlikely to reverse quickly. European defense contractors reported a combined order backlog increase of approximately 68 billion euros in the first quarter of this year, the largest single quarter increase in the history of the European defense industrial base. That number represents fear converted into contracts, and contracts create industrial capacity that, once built, does not disappear when the political weather changes. A European defense industry that can supply European armies without routing orders through American manufacturers is a different geopolitical structure than the one that has existed since 1949. Germany announced the construction of a new ammunition production facility in February that will, at full capacity, produce more artillery shells per year than Germany produced in the entire decade of the 2010s. France accelerated a program to develop autonomous satellite-based early warning systems that do not depend on shared American intelligence infrastructure. These are not rhetorical responses. They are industrial decisions with 30-year implications, and they were made directly in response to the uncertainty that the first 4 months of this year created. The Kremlin's analysts track European defense industrial output as a primary indicator of Western cohesion. What those analysts are reading in the data for the first quarter of this year is the beginning of a European rearmament cycle that will, when complete, produce a continent significantly more capable of defending itself without America. That sounds like a security gain. In the context of alliance politics, it is also a decoupling, and decoupling is the word Russian strategic planners have used in their internal documents, captured in the intelligence record, to describe the goal they have been pursuing since the end of the Cold War. The historical parallel that analysts keep reaching for in private conversations is not a flattering one for any American administration. In the late 1970s, a combination of détente fatigue, domestic political exhaustion following Vietnam and Watergate, and genuine uncertainty about American strategic commitments produced a period of alliance anxiety in Western Europe that Soviet planners attempted to exploit through the Euro missile crisis. The exploitation failed, ultimately, because the alliance held. European governments absorbed the pressure, maintained their commitments, and the Soviet deployment of SS-20 missiles was matched by the NATO deployment of Pershing IIs and cruise missiles, which ended the episode on Western terms. The reason the alliance held in that period was not that the American commitment was never in doubt. It was frequently in doubt. The reason it held was that the institutional architecture of collective decision-making gave European governments a mechanism for coordinating their responses independent of any single American leader's preferences. That architecture is what is now under pressure, not from Soviet missiles, not from Russian disinformation, from the expressed preferences of the American president himself, delivered in public on the record to an audience that includes every government on earth that is trying to calculate whether the last 70 years of American security guarantees will survive the next 4. The answer those governments have settled on is not that the guarantees are gone. It is that the guarantees are contingent in a way they were not contingent before, and contingent guarantees require contingency plans. Contingency plans, in the language of military and diplomatic strategy, mean hedging. Hedging means building independent capability. Building independent capability means reducing dependence on the guarantor. Reducing dependence on the guarantor means the guarantor's leverage over the alliance decreases. Decreased leverage means the alliance, as a structure, moves toward a different center of gravity. That is the sequence. It is not fast. It is not dramatic. It does not produce a headline on any single day that captures its full significance. It produces instead a gradual structural shift that accumulates over years and decades, and that is visible in retrospect with a clarity that it never quite achieves in the present tense. Russia has been trying to initiate that sequence for 20 years. The sequence is now running. It is running not because Russia found a way to start it. It is running because the person with the most influence over whether it started or not made a series of choices in public over 4 months that were in every meaningful strategic sense indistinguishable from the choices Russia would have made for him. The Kremlin did not plant those choices. It does not need credit for them. It only needs the results, and the results are arriving precisely on schedule.